Well, thank you for having me. And truly, what you said in your prayer is very much so in my life. Western Reformed Seminary started, I always said, for me, because it was right across the street from where I worked at the time. And you had evening courses. I had gone to Northwest Baptist for 2.5 years, but I wasn't able to continue during the daytime. I had to go get a job and raise kids. You had an evening program, and I was a Calvinist amongst a bunch of Arminians. So in every way, WRS worked extremely well for me. And then you were very kind to me because you accepted a bunch of my credits with, I had gone to mortuary college, which took anatomy and physiology, things which are, really relevant to theology, things like that. You were very good to me. And because of that, I was able to finish. When I had really given up, I didn't think I would ever get back to school to get that. And God has blessed in many, many ways, as you said, given me a lot of opportunity. And for that, I'm very thankful. And the brother was saying, that's where your heart is right now, that idea of opportunity. So I feel your pain, but God will take care of that. All right, well, again, thank you very much. What I want to do is, I have been preaching through the Gospel of Luke. I started about a little bit before Christmas time, knowing that the infancy narratives of the first 2 chapters was coming up and I would be able to time it for Christmas. I missed the timing. I missed it, but because there was just more to preach than I thought would be there. But what I'm doing this morning is I want to share with you a message that I actually already have preached once during that time from Luke chapter 2. And to put you into the context of this, just to remind you where we are, as I said, in the first 2 chapters of Luke, during the infancy narrative there, you have 4 songs that are recorded: the Magnificat by Mary, the Benedictus by Zacharias, the Gloria sung by the angels, and then the Song of Simeon. Now depart, Nunc Dimittis. Dimittis, is that how you say that?
Nunc Dimittis.
Nunc Dimittis, thank you. And then you had the little tag on there about the prophetess Anna, who was a serious Messiah devotee. And it ended with verse 40 of chapter 2, which says, "And the child continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him." Now the child they're referring to there in that passage is the baby Jesus. It serves as a very, very good segue to take us to where Luke is now going to go, and the passage that I want to explore today. And what that is the story of the boy Jesus in the temple. And that begins with verse 41, goes through verse 52. So let's read that passage right now. I'll be reading out of NASV, if you'll follow along in whatever translation you use. 2:41. "And his parents used to go to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. And as they were returning after spending the full number of days, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents were unaware of it, but supposed him to be in the caravan, and went a day's journey, and they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. And it came about that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when they saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, 'Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you.' And he said to them, 'Why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house?' And they did not understand the statement which he made to them. He went down with them. He came to Nazareth. He continued in subjection to them. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. These verses, as I studied them, became very interesting and should be to any serious Bible student or reader of the Bible. The reason is because this is the record, the only record, of the only fact that we know about Jesus during the time between his infancy and what we call the beginning of his ministry at age 30. I look over at chapter 3, verse 23, the beginning of the genealogy, and when he began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years of age. And so you have these two gaps here. This one before here, between his infancy and now as a young lad of 12, and then at the end of this passage, between this and 30. And this is it. This is it. Luke gives it to us. Now, perhaps you might not think that that's a big deal, but what's interesting is it became a big deal throughout church history, and you must know this, of course. We are curious. We are naturally curious to know things. We would like to know the daily history of the growth of Jesus as he was growing up. Much must have occurred during that time. And in fact, speculation on those things that might have occurred led to a whole bunch of writings, non-canonical, spurious writings of things that might have happened in Jesus' lifetime. For instance, I cite this one. I had heard this many years ago. I went back and looked a little more closely. In one of the apocryphal Gospels, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, you probably know this story. As the story goes, Jesus is playing as a young boy in the dirt, and don't know how he did it, but he turned the dirt into mud, and then he turned the mud into birds, and then he played with the birds, and then the birds were his companions, and then he threw them up in the air, and the mud bird flew away. That's rather bizarre, to say the least. And you can see why they're known as apocryphal Gospels and are not canonical, as they. But the point is that this is what gave rise to this, the speculation of people wondering what was Jesus all about during these times when he was growing up. The passage that we read also highlights another ongoing theological controversy, and that is, and no doubt you have all thought of this and considered it, you've had to, the doctrine of the melding of the humanity and the deity of Jesus. When we see him in these situations as a boy, he is a boy, but he's the God boy. And what do we do with that? The rise of Docetism, for instance, and the Greek word which means to seem. Docetism meaning the idea that Jesus seemed to be human, but it was only an illusion. Gave rise to heresies in Christianity, and particularly in Christology throughout the years, which happily were settled in the mid 451, the Council of I've heard it pronounced recently Chalcedon. I've always called it Chalcedon or Chalcedon, where the creed that came out of that had to do with the defining of the humanity and the deity of Christ. A little lesser known creed probably than some of the others, because I think it's more complex. I think it's very intense. I conclude that as my opening statement in this way. Matthew Henry, it is vain to wish for more. J.C. Ryle, if it had been good for us to know more, more would have been revealed. We leave it there. We know not those years, but this is it, this one passage that Luke gives us. Now, as I was preparing to preach this message, I had gotten to the point where I had it together, but I had one of my daughters and her husband were visiting us. And so I cornered my son-in-law before I preached it, and I threw it out to him. I said, let me read this text to you, and then you just tell me what are the main teachings that you see obviously that come out of this passage. So I read it to him, and we talked about, he said, well, the feast of the Passover, that they were celebrating that, the concept of Jesus being in the temple, and of course that what was going on there with the teachers and that. And then, of course, the dialogue of the statement that Jesus makes with his mother, Mary, which is huge. I'm going to enlarge on it in just a few minutes. But he kind of got to the end of himself and he said, there's one more thing that's there, but he was real careful. He didn't want to say it too strongly, but he said, we could comment on the parenting skills of Mary and Joseph. And I thought, interesting. Now, part of the reason I felt that way was because my wife, I'm going to tell a secret on her, and the reason, by the way, I can get out of this is because I just didn't happen to be there. Many, many years ago, as most of you know, we have a large family. And my wife was with our kids. We had about 7 at that time at the Puyallup Fair. And she lost one of our kids for a period of about 15 minutes. And then she shared that with me at the end of the day. And of course, she was panic-stricken. I mean, it was incredible what she went through because she lost a kid at the fair. And of course, when my son-in-law said that, the parenting skills of Mary and Joseph, I thought, wow, I can identify, I think. Certainly my wife can. Well, I'm going to give them a pass on this for 2 reasons, and here's why. Number 1, in verse 44, we have the word caravan that appears there. And if you do your historical homework on this term, apparently, I wasn't there, but apparently caravan meant this. For the Feast of the Passover and those holidays, if you will, that the Jews recognized, it was not uncommon for an entire village to leave at the same time and to go to Jerusalem. So it was sometimes as many as maybe 1,000 people in this caravan. Now add to that the fact that Jesus was, dare I say it, a teenager. He was 12, 13, all right? And whatever else is going through your mind regarding a teenager when I say that, keep this in mind. A teenager is right in the middle of a person who can take care of themselves and who can't. And so it's not unlikely that in the return back, and by the way, another thing was that women apparently would leave sooner because they didn't go as fast as the men did. And so the women would take off earlier, and then the men would follow behind them, and then they would join when they ended for the night. So you have a scenario where very likely Mary was at the front, Joseph was at the back. Mary said, "Oh, I thought he was with you." And Joseph said, "Well, I figured he was with you." His 12-year-old. So that's one reason that we can give them a pass. It was probably a legitimate thing, and I would hope you would give my dear wife a pass as well. The second reason, though, I give them a pass is because theologically, in the providence of God, this was going to take place because there was a teaching that God was going to bring about through this thing. And so there was a sense in which we know that God had his way here in this thing. So with that, what I want to do is remind you of this. We are dealing with the humanity of Jesus here. This is the boy Jesus as he is growing in stature, and I'll show you why that's important to consider that. Like us, he needs to grow and mature in the same way. What I want to do is highlight 3 teachings that I took out of this passage and just camp out on them just for a few minutes each one. The first is this. In verses 41 and 42, we might tend to overlook this, where it says that his parents would go to Jerusalem every year at the Feast of the Passover. And by the way, 3 times a year they were required to do this. Passover, the Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles from Exodus chapter 12. And any good Jewish person, particularly those who lived close to Jerusalem, were required to come to those 3 times. So we have that spoken to us very clearly in 41, 42. And Joseph and Mary, as married parents, and I say we might overlook this, honored God's appointed ordinances. Honored God's appointed ordinances. Verse 43 refers to the idea that they were there for the full number of days. It was estimated that the travel would be difficult. It would be a minimum of 10 days of commitment. It would be financially strapping. It would be fatiguing. There was sacrifice involved in doing this. But the positive side would be that they would be with people who were of like mind. The company that we keep influences us greatly in life. In verse 42, we're told that Jesus was 12. That becomes significant because at age 13, he would have gone through the Jewish custom of bar mitzvah, where he would have become a man, if you will, a full member of the synagogue. And it's very likely that at age 12, what they were doing was bringing him there to introduce him to the temple and to what was going on, as if to say, this is what's going to happen with you next year at this time, when they brought him back as a 13-year-old. And I guess my point that I'm trying to make is this: their commitment to God's opportunities served as a tremendous testimony, of course, to Jesus, and it goes on to serve as a testimony to you and to me today. We want to create a thirst for spiritual things at a young age in our children, and that is primarily done by the testimony of the parents in their commitment to the things that God has laid out as his ordinances to do. Forsake not the assembly of yourselves, as the manner of some is. All that to say, let me simply reduce it down to 3 words. Go to church. Go to church when the doors are open. Why do we do this? Because we want to be around God's people and around God's word. We will benefit. Our children will benefit as well. As I say, that's kind of a subtle teaching in this passage here, but one that we don't want to overmiss. Mary and Joseph were spot on that. All right, the second teaching that I enlarge on, that I find in this passage, has to do with the example that Jesus gives to us and to young people as to what it was that he was doing there at the temple. In verse 46, it says, it came about that after 3 days they found him in the temple sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. Sitting in the midst, and verse 47, all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. Now, here is where the whole thing about the humanity and the deity of Christ should kick in your minds. When it says that Jesus was listening, asking questions, and giving amazing answers, are we surprised at that? Well, in one sense, we say, no, he was God. He could have taught them at the time. But I don't think that's the essence of this passage here, because we're looking at the humanity of Jesus, and he is growing in every way humanly. And I don't have the ultimate answer about this probably any more than you do, but I think that there are a couple of things that we can take from it, because we may never fully understand that whole humanity-deity thing. One thing, Jesus was not found playing around the corner with the other kids, which is probably where my kids would have been. But rather, he's learning and sitting. He's swift to hear those who were wise and prudent. Now, let me just add this. The last time I was here 3 or 4 months ago, went through the library and bought some books and things, and you had a book here called Expository Listening. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. It caught my eye, and I thought that's fascinating. I knew about expository preaching. In fact, I'm pretty much now sold out for the rest of my life to expository preaching. But I had never heard expository listening, and it was a fascinating book. This idea that Jesus sat there and expositorily, if you will, listened. He had a thirst for knowledge, and this thirst for knowledge was actually the beginning statement of an axiom which applies to all of us, and that is this: it is vitally important, if we want to grow and increase in wisdom and knowledge and stature and find favor with God and man, that's what the text says, then listen and ask questions of those whose wisdom and stature is greater than ours. It's pretty simple to remember. I think it's a very, very good rule. In fact, I've said to people, whenever I get lucky and I know, don't use that word, but I get lucky and preach well, and someone says to me, that was a really good message. And as I've had people even ask me, so how do you do that? I always say, I think the key is knowing who to read and how to study. And I was very, very blessed that shortly after I was saved, right after I was saved, God put me in a Calvinistic Baptist church, albeit Baptist, but it was a Calvinistic church. And there were probably 20 or 25 people there who were just common people who had as much theological knowledge as the pastor did. And I was trained from day one, informally at that church, who to read and how to read. And I try to encourage anybody now, I say, it has a lot to do with who you're reading and what you're reading. So I think that was the case here. Jesus is sitting at the feet of those who were wiser, humanly speaking, than he was, and he's going to grow in wisdom and stature in that way. Paul says, study to show yourself approved. That's encouraged to all believers. We can't go to the temple, and we can't question people of that in that level, but my heavens, books, the internet. Is there anything Google doesn't know? I hate conceding that fact, but I'm going to the computer more and more often, Google, boop, and I got 25 different resources to do my homework. So, in the passage, Jesus is a young boy at the temple. He is giving us a model of how to grow in Christ. That is a lifelong investment for us all, which brings reward both in this life, and I'm convinced that it is going to bring reward in the life to come as well. I'm not sure how that shakes out, but I think there's something about the more that we grow in this life, the more it benefits us in eternity. Maybe you guys can add to that for me and take that even further. Interestingly, this idea of being serious about this and growing in the stature and knowledge of the Lord, some do better than others, but yet clearly from this passage, what we would want to do is see that we can encourage this in young people. And no doubt that's why it's given, or what has given rise to all the things that we do for kids, Awana and Young Life and Youth for Christ and all those things, some better than others perhaps, but all intending on getting kids when they're young and teaching them how to learn. We have a great example of that here in Jesus at the temple. The last of the three areas that I want to address in this passage is the dialogue between Jesus and his mother. It is interesting. I gave you the example of my wife at the Puyallup Fair. Our experience, it would seem to me, goes something like this, if this was to happen. You lose your child. You have a tremendous amount of anxiety of the parent, bordering on being frantic, of looking for this child. Then you find the child. God be thanked. You have this tremendous relief, joy, hugs, kisses, and then you yell at the kid. Yeah. That's what we typically do. What's the matter with you? Are you an idiot? Don't you know you're supposed to hold your sister's hand? And it goes on. Interestingly, in our text, it seems more soft than that. If there were any expletives, they were deleted. But you get the feeling, interesting, in verse 48, it says, when they saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you. One gets the feeling that in that verse, in that statement, there is an air of reproach in her language to Jesus, her son, Jesus. 48 through 50, the answer in 49. He said to them, why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house? And then verse 50 says very subtly, and they did not understand the statement which he had made to them. And I said to myself, really? Mary says, why did you treat me that way? It's like she takes it as a personal affront, as if it was premeditated. It declares her anxiety. You're not supposed to do this to your parents. That's not abnormal. That's like any mother would react. But I think the understanding of this becomes clear when you consider Jesus' response. What it is very succinct. It is not particularly apologetic. You notice that he doesn't have any words of, gee, Mom, I'm sorry, I never gave it a thought. I didn't know it would break your heart. You'd be fearful. He doesn't say any of those things. Rather, what he does is he gives an explanation. And Jesus seems to say that they should have understood this. Now, that's not that hard to imagine because, remember, this is Mary who had had angelic visits, told her about this son that she was going to have. And so it's as if Jesus says, and as if I would have been standing beside him saying, yeah, don't you remember the angel told you, what this was going to be all about. But she's taken back by this. Is his very succinct answer. And then it says in verse 50, they didn't understand this. So what I believe, what we're seeing here is this. It is the early declaration of a 12-year-old Son of God, fully human, giving a pronounced hint of what his life was going to look like from this point on. In other words, what he had come to do. He was no common person. He was not here to do common work. He was shifting from his Father on earth to his Father in heaven. And his errand on earth was to do the Father's will and finish that work to the utmost. John 17:4 in the high priestly prayer at the end of his life, I have glorified you on the earth, having accomplished the work which you have given me to do, the active and the passive obedience of Christ to the Father's will in every single way. He had a very special relationship with God, and they didn't understand that at that point very well. The Father in heaven was demanding now his first attention from this point on. And that posture is now going to continue in the life of Jesus until he goes to the cross. Did you notice that he said, when Mary says to him, she says, your Father and I. And Jesus responds by saying, my Father. There's the shift. His respect to the Father, God the Father, must not be understood as a disrespect to them. For verse 51 tells us that he went down with them, he came to Nazareth, he continued in subjection to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. Mary pondered them, much like chapter 2, verse 19, after the angel had appeared to her. And Jesus now would be about his Father's work. Psalm 119, 99 and 100. Listen to these words. I have more insight than all my teachers, for thy testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the aged, because I observe thy precepts. They were amazed as they tried to understand his wisdom. And then the passage ends, and nothing else is going to be said regarding these growing, maturing days of Jesus prior to his ministry, which will start as a 30-year-old. Did you notice the Oreo cookie ends here? We came into the passage with chapter 2, verse 40. The child continued to grow and became strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And then at the end, verse 52, and Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. There's the bookends and what's between it. You may speculate as to what went on in the growing years of Jesus' life. I would not advise that. I like the quotes of Ryle and Matthew Henry. Enough is enough. We have everything that we need. I entitled this message, The Boy Jesus in the Temple. I might have changed it to this title. After the fact, I thought of this. A needed reminder given by Jesus that he is on a mission from heaven by God the Father. It's a wonderful passage, really. Amen.